Q&A, or will you?
I will.
Okay, perfect.
Hmm.
Thank you so much.
No problem. No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, come on in. Come on in. We're going to let you come in a little early. And if you'd like to, state where you're from, hope you had a wonderful break. So you could just give a little greetings in the chat, and you can state what state you're coming from, and we will be beginning in about a minute. We're going to get started in about a minute. All right, Arizona, Houston. I know it's hot down there. North Carolina, South Carolina, Atlanta, New Jersey, Alabama, Washington, Arkansas, Ohio, Texas. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad you're here today. Louisiana, that's where my family's from. Kenya, wow, welcome. Iowa, Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, Jersey. All right. Okay, we're going to get started now. Um, we have three more sessions, and then we will be on a 30-minute lunch break. So we're going to get started right now. So strap in. Let's enjoy our next presenter. Our next presenter is our only international presenter, and she's from Ontario, Canada. Um, she is let me pull my sheet up. She is from Toronto, Canada, and she is a elementary school librarian. And I would like for everyone to welcome Rabia Kokar. Welcome, and you can begin.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm going to get started. And it's such an honor and privilege to be here with you all. Thank you all so much for being here and being part of this presentation. So, I'm going to be talking about building an equitable book collection. So, let's get started. Just wanted to welcome you all again. So in this workshop, we're going to be doing some theoretical understandings. We'll do some tips and strategies, and then we'll do a Q&A. So to really start thinking about how to build an equitable book collection, it starts with a story, and it starts with my story. So growing up in Toronto as an elementary school student, I never really saw myself reflected in books. And I really loved stories with magic and adventure, like the Magic Treehouse series that are really popular. But I never really saw myself reflected in those, types of books. And so I just internalized that maybe I love these books, but as a Muslim, South Asian student, I'm not really going to be represented in them. And I just sort of accepted that as the norm. I continue to love these books, but I just sort of internalized that, of course, someone with like me or with my identity is not necessarily going to be represented. And so, I continued loving books. And it was when I was around like 9 or 10 that I came across a book called Does My Head Look Big in This? That was the first time I saw an aspect of my identity represented in a book. And I was so excited. I took it out of the public library and I carried this book everywhere with me. I took it, I slept beside it and I kept renewing it because it was so like impactful for me to uh, see a part of my identity like represented in a positive way. And even though at the time I didn't really wear a hijab, just seeing a part of my identity reflected positively was so impactful for me. And so my own story and my own lived experiences teach me that it's so important for all of our students to have their identities affirmed within story. And that's really the root message of this workshop today, is how to build this equitable book collection to serve all of our students. And so now, as I'm part of the school library space, I know that there are books and more stories with, racialized characters or just characters of different identities in stories of adventure and, all of these different things, such as these two books. And it shows me that, there's progress that's happening, but it also reminds me of our own intentional choices that we can take to represent all of our students. And so, we talk a lot about equity. And so, what does equity mean in relation to book collections and curating book collections? Well, it has to start with understanding the role of stories and books in our lives, particularly at the elementary school level, where books are really the staple and the ways in which we, teach all of these different skills. It's the way that we socialize students, and it carries on to middle school, high school, and adulthood as well. And so, when we think about the power of stories, I'm reminded of Thomas King, who's an Indigenous writer, and he says, the truth about stories is that's all we are. And so, if stories are so powerful, we have to think about the role that they play in the lives of our students and in our children. And my own story shows us that, stories are so powerful and so impactful. And so, if we're thinking about equity and book collections, we have to center the power of story first. Chimamanda Adichie goes on to say that stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And so, in our socio-political context, stories matter, and stories have been used either to stereotype, to, reinforce biases. But in the school library and in libraries in general, stories can be used to empower, to humanize, and to restore the dignity of people and communities. And that's really where our role as school library professional comes into play. We can really impact the type of stories that we bring into our spaces. And part of that equity background is recognizing the role stories play in our classroom, in our school, and in our wider community. I love this quote by this rabbi. They say, we need diverse representation, not only so every kid can see themselves as the hero of the story, but so that every kid can understand that other kind of kids are also the heroes of the stories. And so our role with stories and recognizing the power of stories is to help affirm as well as expand experiences, but also to show all types of children that they can be the heroes, as well as allow them to see that other type of kids can also be heroes. And that's really the work of the story and the power that we have as library professionals. And so, another idea that's really helping us think about equity in relation to book collection is to really think beyond a tokenistic representation. I'll give you this scenario by Beverly Daniel Tatum. She talks about how, there's a group picture that's being taken. And whenever there's a group picture that's taken, we always want to like zoom in on ourselves and we want to see if we look right. We want to check to see if our eyes are open, if we're wearing a tie, if our tie is straight, or if our hijab is straight. And it's the same way that students come into our spaces, or students want to see themselves in books. They want to see themselves in the story. They want to see themselves in this group picture. But they don't just want to see themselves in a tokenistic way. They want to see themselves in this picture, in this book looking good. And so, equity consideration in relation to book curation is really focused on moving beyond just tokenistic representation where, people of different identities are just plopped in different places, but rather it's working to highlight and to amplify books that show good representation, authentic representation. And that's really our role as library professionals. And so, another consideration when we think about what equity means in relation to book curation is to be aware of our local and global socio-political context. As school library professionals, we want to curate in a way that's very intentional, relevant, responsive. And, the school library is not a neutral place. The school is not a neutral place. And so we need to be aware of, the positive things that are happening in the world, like the activism, the awareness, the hope, all of these beautiful things that are happening in the world. But we also want to be aware of the not so nice things that are happening in the world, like, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, all of these other isms that are taking place. And we want to, be responsive to what's happening. And we want to provide, a positive and a balance and an authentic representation. And so, we cannot separate our work from what's happening in our local as well as global communities. Rather, that work informs the type of intentional work that we do in our spaces. And so, those are some tips in terms of thinking critically about what equity means in relation to book curation. And this part two, I'm going to be sharing some tips and strategies on how we can bring this, in a tangible, practical way into our different contexts. And so let's get started with that. So the first tip that I have that's, worked well for me is to consider your entire collection. So what type of a story will this single book tell in your entire collection? What story does your specific, genre, a specific genre or a specific space in your library tell? And then what story does your entire collection tell, and how are particular books landing in these sections? So it's really about, looking at the individual, but also the collective, and always having the individual as well as the collective in mind. And so some, questions that have worked with me to help me think critically about my collection is to think about, what impact does this book have on my collection? What story does this specific section or genre tell? And what story does my entire collection tell? And who is included in this story? Is someone missing? How can I include more voices? And, does my entire collection tell a global as well as a local story? And so, very important to consider the individual as well as the collective, and to kind of remember that there's a relationship between the two, and they create the story of your collection. The second tip I have is to really consider who's telling and illustrating the story. In times like this, it's very important that we use our positional power as library professionals to really center, highlight, amplify the voices of people writing their own stories, people illustrating their own stories. And I love this quote by an Indigenous elder who says, "If someone else tells your story, it comes out crooked." And I think our role as library professionals is really to use our positional power to highlight voices from different communities. And so, I think it's also important to think about if there can be such a thing as ally writers or illustrators. And I think it really depends on the specific context. It depends on the story that's being told, the story that's being illustrated. It depends on the relationship that, that person or group has with the community that they're trying to write about, illustrate. So it has to be a very individual by individual basis. But I want to show you an example of what an ally writer could, or an ally illustrator could look like. This is a new book that I got, and it's, centered on the theme of friendship. A lot of the books that I'll be highlighting will be picture books in this session. But this is a book that's kind of, it illustrates a Muslim woman and a Muslim family, but it's not written by a Muslim, writer or illustrator. But you can see that there's been like work that's been done to learn about this lived reality and experience, intersectional experience, based on the work the illustrator has done. And so I'll show you some examples. We can see the first page, which is the inside of the story. And this is kind of what the family looks like at home. And you can see that, the Muslim woman is not wearing a hijab at home. And this shows me that there's been work done to really learn about, the group that, this illustrator is trying to represent. And we can see on the outside, like in the public realm and public place, the mother is wearing a hijab. And so there's these intentional, moves that really impact the story that's being told. And I think it's very important, if you're illustrating or writing about a group that you're not part of, that you take time to learn about how these intricacies play out. And my tip number 3 would be to really center universal stories that are just beyond pain and suffering. We want stories of community, like Thank You, Omu. We want stories of hobbies and fun activities. We want stories that show people completely, that show different identity groups, different lived realities, just engaging in these universal experiences. And I think these type of stories amplify as well as affirm various lived experiences. I really love the book Fatima's Great Outdoors because it shows this Pakistani South Asian family going on their first camping trip. And I think it really humanizes and it disrupts so many, stereotypes about Muslim communities. And it really helps us see that universal story. And so it's very important to center stories that are really universal stories, friendship, identity, um, family, and all of these stories with different characters. I think that's really powerful for all students to see. Another example of a universal story is this book, The Katka Chest. And this story is really about family. And, there's a character learning about this family heirloom that's like a quilt. It's very important. And so, these type of stories really restore the humanity of groups that, have often been silenced or missing from stories. And seeing a story like this is so powerful because there's so many different things that we can identify with, we can learn from. So really, focusing on moving beyond just showing pain and suffering, it's a balanced perspective. So that's one part of the story, but it shouldn't be the whole story that we tell about communities. And as library professionals, we really have the opportunity to impact this change. Tip number 4 would be to center the stories of well-developed characters. This story of Rob Kinnerney, who was a strong man, really shows this strong character who really develops throughout the story. We see this character trying to navigate his identity where, as a strong man, he's, the stereotype is that he has to be this, macho man. Whereas, he just really loves wearing all of these colorful things. He loves, lots of bold prints. And I think this story shows us this strong character who's navigating his identity, but also finds a way to affirm his identity and recognize that he can be all of these things because that's really who he is. And that's what defines who he is. And so centering well-developed, strong characters is one of the ways that we can send a really powerful message to our, students and those we serve. Tip number 5 would be to really check the details of the story. So what are the details of the story that really share like what the story is about? And so, this story that I just got, Goodnight Toronto, Toronto is a very culturally, religiously, racially diverse community. But in this story, we notice that there's only like a particular representation. It doesn't really represent what Toronto is or like what my Toronto looks like and feels like. And so this story I can see in the details with the people that are represented, what they're wearing, where they might be, through the setting. I can see that it's showing like a very singular narrative of what it means to be a person who lives in Toronto. Whereas this story, My Name is Sajan Singh, through the details of the story, shows me this character who's dynamic, diverse. Without even telling me, it teaches me more about him, his family, his cultural, religious identity, and just with the positioning of what's on the dinner table, like the roti with the curry, it teaches me so much about the intricacies of his identity. And I can see that there's been time taken to really represent this experience authentically. And so, as library professionals, it's really important that we're checking and we're looking out for these, details, that we're kind of putting a magnifying glass and we're trying to see like what does the story say beyond the words? What do the pictures mean? Who's represented in the picture? Does it really show a real, image of what it means to be this person or to have this identity. And I think as we start to have these conversations, we start to become critical ourselves. And I think it's also where we can make relationships and collaborate with each other, such as, through this professional development opportunity where we can lean into each other. We all have to do our own work, but we can lean into each other to help each other, to really curate this equitable collection. And just as I finish up, we started with thinking about what equity means and looks like in relation to book curation. And I want to remind you of the power of stories, because stories impact people. And so, Thomas King says, want a different ethic? Tell a different story. And if we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives. And I think as library professionals, we have the opportunity to curate equitable collections that tell a more authentic and comprehensive story that reflects people of all identities authentically in the ways that they want. And I think we have that, positional power and that choice to really bring about this change. And I see this change in my own life as well, as a young person who didn't really see myself reflected in story. And now when I go to bookstores or I go to schools and libraries, I can see that, things are changing in terms of what's purchased, what's displayed, how the books land in different students' hands. And I think to my own, experience of how this impacts my niece, I didn't really have books that represented me authentically or positively, but I wonder how this can change for our children and the children that we love and care about and the children that we serve, and how, having books that will represent and affirm their identities will impact them in such positive ways and help them develop their identities, but also build respect and understanding for other people in their communities. And I just wanted to say thank you. And I think we're going to start the Q&A very soon. But here is just my contact information. And thank you so much for listening and this opportunity.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Let me remove myself real quick so you can see her page. So give her a second. I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to do a screenshot with all her contact information. It's there. There was a question that came up, and it says, I can put it on the screen. What do you do with the books that you don't want to have in your library? Example, what would you do with Goodnight Toronto, the Goodnight Toronto book?
I think that's such a good question. And I think it's always hard to like know what to do. But I think if that was a book that was coming out, I think I'd be critical about it. Maybe I would perhaps use it with some students to show like what's missing or to get them to think about. But maybe I also like might not put it in the collection, or it might just be like one perspective. If I had this book, I would ensure that the other books I had in this section would show like a more comprehensive perspective. So even if I included it in my collection, I think I would be more intentional about the other books that I also have about Toronto or this setting within that collection. So I would be concerned about like the story that this overall section would tell, if that makes sense. So I think I would just curate more intentionally, even if I had this book in my collection.
Any other questions? You can pop your questions into the chat and we can have Rabia answer them before time runs out. I have a question. Do you see much difference between the US and Canada in terms of some of the challenges that are currently taking place right now?
So I do know a little bit about, some of the challenges that are taking place. I think from my own experience, I think there are like some books that are challenged. I don't think that there's as many books that are challenged in like in Canada or Ontario. There are always like a few that might be challenged, but it's not as much, or maybe I'm just not aware, but in my experience it's not as much of the books that, are challenged.
We have a question here. What resources do you recommend for finding good books?
There's so many different resources that people have put together in terms of like how to do content analysis of the books that you have. There's one that I've put together on my website, so if you're interested in that, but there's so many others as well. So you can kind of Google like content analysis of books, picture books, or looking closely at picture books. There's like a lot of different frameworks that can be used. And I think another strategy I would give is to just like read a lot of books, and I think we do as library professionals, but I think it's through reading and kind of like questioning and looking at the pages that we become critical ourselves, and we kind of develop this um, framework that we use. So I would say like lean into other folks who might have put together some sort of like frameworks that help us think critically about how to look at the books, but also to just continue reading more, because I think once we start reading and looking for these types of either intentional or explicit or implicit messages, I think we kind of get more into the habit of it.
Another question is, do you have a go-to resource for inclusive selection recommendations?
On my website, I have put together like a framework of like how to choose books. That could be a starting place for you to maybe start to think about or continue the work of like what are some of the things that you should think about and highlight, and your own considerations. So maybe starting there, and then also reaching out to other folks who have also put together those things, because my perspective is just one, but there's a whole lot of research and a whole lot of folks who have been doing this work for a long time.
What do you do to include families in selecting more diverse books with their children?
Yeah, I think that's so important. In the schools that I've worked at, I've really tried to like establish a relationship with the families that I'm serving. And sometimes that's looked like doing some like professional development for families as well, um, in during accessible times for them. So I know in the past year, I was able to put together like a little presentation for families with like accessible information, and some of the things that they should be looking out for when they're either going to the public library or school library. So I think it's kind of like making that relationship and collaboration with families, but also then helping communicate this information in like family friendly ways and making it accessible for them.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of great comments in the chat. People are very appreciative. They have
Thank
really
you.
liked the presentation that you provided today. On the screen, you will see a ticker where you can visit Rabia's Rabia's website
Mhm.
and connect with her further there. Can you please take a moment, everyone, and just give her some love in the chat? This was a great session. And I'm excited because I'm going to go back and listen to all these presentations again because I'm multitasking here. There were so many great gems that have been dropped. So thank you so much for everything that you presented. And thank you for presenting a course from Canada. You're our only Canadian that is presenting today. Yay.
Thank
So
you
thank
so
you
much.
once again.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be here with you all, and it's so like amazing to see all of this passion, because I think that's what helps us do this work intentionally. So thank you so much for putting this together, and for all of the folks for interacting.
And as Jones Education Consulting has said, go Canada. Love Canada, says Lisa Studell. Thank you,
A
thank you,
lot of
thank you.
love. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna move on to our next session. So
Thank
if
you so much,
you could,
everyone.
thank you. No, thank you for coming in today. We're
Thank
gonna
you.
head to our next session. So go to your attendees sheet and click in, and I'm gonna start the next session. Take
Thank you
care
so
and
much.
thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.